What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate, said Carl Jung. This phrase sounds like a warning, but in reality, it describes what each of us experiences. We are convinced that we know ourselves, our habits, desires, values. We create the image of a decent person who tries to act honestly, fairly, with dignity. We persuade ourselves that this image is our true personality. But there are moments when the familiar mask falls off. A sudden outburst of anger, a hurtful word spoken without thought, an action that later seems inexcusable. And we are left wondering, why did I do that? Why did I say this? The answer is unsettling, but at the same time magnetic. Inside each of us lives another side, hidden, rejected, pushed deep within. Jung called it the shadow. The shadow is everything we don't want to admit. Envy, irritation, shame, greed, and desires that seem troubling or unacceptable. We pretend it does not exist, yet it continues to live and act, and the more we try to deny its existence, the greater the power it gains over us. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. And this is precisely why the encounter with the shadow is an inevitable step if we want to discover the truth about ourselves." But before we can understand how it influences us, we must first clarify what the shadow actually is and what image it carries within our psyche. The shadow in the human psyche is not just a metaphor, and not only a scientific term. To explain its nature, people have used many images throughout the centuries. It has been called the rejected self, the lower self, the dark twin, the suppressed half of the personality, the alter ego, the inner adversary with whom a person wages an endless struggle, or the underworld into which one must descend during times of crisis. Connie Zweig wrote, "The shadow goes by many familiar names. The rejected self, the lower self, the dark twin or brother in the Bible and myths, the double, the suppressed self, the alter ego, the id. When we come face to face with our dark side, we use metaphors to describe these shadow encounters. Meeting our demons, struggling with the devil, descending into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the midlife crisis. The shadow is that part of ourselves which we have learned to push away, to hide, and to refuse to acknowledge. It exists within every human being, and it cannot be eliminated or banished forever. We may close our eyes, pretend that these impulses, desires, and thoughts do not belong to us. But that would be self-deception, because the shadow remains even if we refuse to look in its direction. This idea has always found its reflection in myths and literature. In 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In it, the respected Dr. Jekyll symbolized the respectable, socially approved personality, while Mr. Hyde embodied the hidden, gloomy, and destructive side. And the harder Jekyll tried to maintain control, the more power Hyde gained, until he destroyed the life of his creator. This story became not only a work of fiction, but also a vivid metaphor for how the shadow can take control if we deny it. Carl Jung pointed out that denying the shadow is both pointless and dangerous. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. And this means that the more deeply we push it into the unconscious, the heavier its force becomes. It interferes with our intentions, distorts even our best motives, and drives us to actions we later cannot explain. Thus, the shadow is not an enemy and not an accidental flaw in our psyche. It is a fundamental part of it, always accompanying us whether we admit it or not. And this is precisely why the encounter with the shadow is inevitable. We may spend energy trying to deny it, but sooner or later, it will make itself known in our actions, thoughts, dreams, and feelings. However, the shadow is not limited to myths and metaphors. It manifests in our everyday life, and remaining in the shade of consciousness begins to quietly influence us. From the earliest years, a person faces the fact that certain aspects of their nature provoke disapproval, fear, or shame. Within each of us, there are impulses of aggression, a drive for dominance, desires of a sexual nature, and selfish tendencies. All those qualities that in different times and cultures were considered undesirable or threatening. In order to fit into society, we learn to suppress these parts of ourselves, to hide them deep in the unconscious, pretending that they do not belong to us at all. Parental prohibitions, punishments, and reproaches, schoolyard ridicule, or the strict moral instructions of those around us gradually form within us an inner censor, one that relentlessly filters out everything deemed unacceptable. We begin to believe that this is how it must be, that shame and suppression are the only ways to be normal. But at the same time, we forget that the suppressed qualities do not disappear. They continue to live within us, hidden and unrecognized, but no less active because of it. Jung wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." These words mean that what we repress and refuse to acknowledge in ourselves still returns into our lives, but not as an inner experience. Instead, as external circumstances in which we find ourselves again and again. We begin to notice that we fall into the same situations, face similar problems, and make the same mistakes. It seems to us like misfortune, coincidence, or bad luck. But in reality, it is the shadow that guides our choices and reactions. It operates behind the scenes, quietly pushing us toward actions and decisions we would never consciously take. And the more we try to deny its existence, the stronger its power becomes. The shadow breaks through in sudden bursts of anger, in urges we cannot control, in harmful habits, and in actions we cannot explain. It is like an invisible director arranging the stage of our lives, forcing us to repeat the same script over and over until we finally decide to look it in the face. And yet, its influence is not always expressed directly. Most often we encounter the shadow in the mirror of our relationships with other people, in what we call projections. When a person is not ready to acknowledge their own hidden sides, they unconsciously look for an outlet for them in others. Jung called this phenomenon projection. We see in those around us the qualities we do not want to notice in ourselves, and we criticize them with particular fervor, as if our inner balance depended on it. Thus, a harsh person may condemn the rudeness of others. A jealous one may accuse a partner of distrust, and someone who does not admit their own tendency to lie will indignantly point out another's insincerity. Jung wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." This thought applies to projections as well. What we repress, we begin to encounter in others. And it is precisely in this encounter that the shadow reminds us of itself. And indeed, it is much easier and even more pleasant to discuss the mistakes and weaknesses of others than to confess our own. In this way, a whole culture of judgment arises, from gossip about acquaintances to endless streams of comments on the internet, where under invented names people allow themselves a harshness and sharpness they would not acknowledge in their everyday lives. Internet trolls are an example of how insecurity and fear of one's own weakness might be beneath the mask of attacks on others. But projection is only one side. The other is harm to oneself. When we do not recognize our own impulses and desires, they break through in the form of dependencies and compulsive habits. Dependence on alcohol, dependence on substances, unhealthy relationships, or compulsive behavior. All of these may be manifestations of the shadow taking the upper hand over the conscious self. A person swears they will quit, that everything will change. But in the next moment, they once again give in to their inner impulse. Because the struggle is not with external circumstances, but with their own repressed part of the personality. And sometimes the understanding of this comes too late. One story illustrates this mechanism well. A little girl, together with her younger brother, decided to run away from home. She gathered toys and food, persuaded her brother to jump out of the window. But at the last moment she became frightened of the consequences and, instead of admitting her mistake, ran to her mother and accused her brother of trying to escape. Her ego did not allow her to confess her own fault, and she unconsciously shifted the responsibility onto another. At that moment, the shadow revealed itself in its purest form. The desire to avoid shame turned out to be stronger than the truth, and projection became a way to preserve the familiar image. We see in others what we do not want to recognize in ourselves. This is not only a beautiful phrase, but also an accurate description of how projection works. And the more fiercely we condemn the shortcomings of others, the greater the likelihood that they are hidden within ourselves. But to meet the shadow means to go much further than simply noticing it in others or in oneself. It is a serious trial that changes the very structure of the personality. Encountering the shadow is never easy. It is not an abstract theory and not a beautiful metaphor, but a real ordeal that sooner or later stands before every person who has decided to truly know themselves. Carl Jung emphasized, meeting oneself is, first of all, meeting one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down into the deep well. But one must learn to know oneself in order to know who one is. These words sound like a warning. The one who truly wants to understand who they are must pass through a narrow and painful corridor, where they will have to admit the most unpleasant aspects of their own nature. Jung and his student, Erich Neumann, wrote that it is precisely here that a person faces the central crisis. They must recognize that within them there is not only light, but also darkness. Not only kindness, but also hardness. Not only moral ideals, but also selfish and questionable impulses. Most people fear such an acknowledgement. It is more comfortable for us to live with the conviction that we are, by our essence, good and pure, that wrongdoing is somewhere outside, that it is others who commit harsh actions, deceive, or break things. It is easier for us to close our eyes to our own impulses of irritation, envy, or greed, and to maintain the illusion that all of this does not concern us. But it is precisely this illusion that makes the shadow stronger, because the rejected part of the personality remains unconscious and therefore heavier. The danger of meeting the shadow lies not only in the shame and inner resistance it provokes. It can shake the very image of oneself that a person has been building for years. Suddenly, it turns out that behind the familiar mask hides not only the one we wanted to be, but also the one we were afraid to become. In this confrontation, it is easy to lose balance, to fall into denial or despair. And that is why Jung called the work with the shadow a matter of moral courage. But at the same time, here opens the greatest opportunity. Only the recognition of the shadow gives wholeness. Only when a person stops pretending to be exclusively light and is ready to look at their inner darkness do they gain the chance to unite these opposites and become an integrated personality. In this lies the true paradox. Strength is not in denial or in struggle, but in recognition and integration. And yet within this trial lies not only danger. There is also a paradoxical source of strength, capable of opening new possibilities for us. When we hear the word shadow, we most often imagine decline, darkness, suppressed outbursts of irritation, and desires that we are afraid to admit in ourselves. But the truth is that the shadow contains not only the destructive aspects of the personality, but also those forces that can become a source of creative and vital potential. Everything that we once were forced to reject remains in the unconscious, and among these qualities there are often our true gifts. Social norms do not always separate what is good from what is bad. Much more often, they form boundaries in which a person is compelled to adapt, suppressing everything that stands out from the common order. And into this same darkness go not only our harsh or questionable impulses, but also that which makes us unique. Strength of character, independence, the ability to go against the majority, original thinking, and the courage to be different. Thus, a person who from an early age displayed independence and anti-authoritarian tendencies could be perceived by society as a threat. And precisely for this reason, their drive to be free and self-reliant was pushed into the shadow. Such qualities, if allowed to manifest in maturity, become not destructive but, on the contrary, constructive. In them lies the energy of innovation, creativity, and freedom. And it is precisely for this reason that the shadow preserves not only what we fear, but also what is capable of leading us beyond limiting patterns. Jung pointed out that the path to individuality is impossible without this step. We must dare to look into the depths and acknowledge that in the shadow lies not only our decline, but also our renewal. He wrote, "The shadow, when it is realized, is the source of renewal. The new and productive impulse cannot come from established values of the ego. When there is a deadlock and sterile time in our lives, despite adequate development of the ego, we must look to the dark, until now unacceptable side which has been at our conscious disposal. Thus the shadow becomes not only a trial, but also a door. It is a door leading to those parts of our personality that were once rejected, but which in truth can become a source of strength, inspiration, and inner growth. And only the one who dares to open it gains access to those talents and possibilities that all this time have been waiting for their moment in the depths of the unconscious. But the strength of the shadow will not reveal itself on its own. In order for it not to destroy but to create, it is necessary to learn how to integrate it into conscious life. Working with the shadow is one of the most difficult yet most rewarding stages on the path of self-knowledge. And first of all, it must be understood. There is no universal technique that would suit everyone. Jung emphasized that this process is unique for each individual, and compared it not to a mechanical exercise, but to the art of diplomacy or even to statesmanship. He wrote, "There is no generally effective technique for assimilating the shadow. It is more like diplomacy or statesmanship, and it is always an individual matter. The encounter with the shadow begins with the first step, the recognition of its existence. As long as a person denies their suppressed sides, they remain a prisoner of them. The awareness that within us there are impulses and desires that do not coincide with our image of the proper person is already the beginning of liberation. Here it is not required to justify or excuse oneself. It is enough to honestly say, 'This too is a part of me.' The second step lies in beginning to observe the manifestations of the shadow. Jung wrote that this occurs through attentive observation of one's own moods, fantasies, and impulses. Everything that arises suddenly, that provokes shame or anxiety, that seems alien to us, is in reality the voice of the repressed part of our personality. The ability to notice these signals is not weakness, but an act of awareness, which allows the unconscious to be brought into the sphere of the conscious. The third step is the process of negotiation. We cannot simply eliminate the shadow, we can only integrate it, finding for it a healthy and productive outlet. This is where diplomacy comes in. Inner energy can be directed into sport, where it becomes strength and determination. Passion can take shape in art and creativity. Becoming a source of inspiration, the drive for influence can be transformed into leadership and the ability to guide others. Each quality, even the most intimidating one, when handled properly, can become not negative but constructive. Jung indicated that this process always requires time and courage. It is not a single moment of revelation, but a long path of negotiations between our ego and that part of ourselves that we have been accustomed to rejecting. But it is precisely in these negotiations that wholeness is born, because a person learns to be in harmony with all sides of their nature, denying neither light nor darkness. And if working with one's own shadow is so important for an individual, then imagine what consequences its denial brings on the scale of entire nations. If the individual shadow is capable of undermining a personality, then the collective shadow weakens entire civilizations. It manifests not in the isolated actions of a single person, but in mass movements, global confrontations, ideologies. In those historical catastrophes where human darkness ceases to remain hidden and bursts outward on a vast scale. Mass conflicts, hatred, historical purges, aggressive expressions, and systematic discrimination are not only the result of political decisions or economic conditions, but also the direct manifestation of the collective unconscious. When millions of people simultaneously project their own shadow onto others, they discover enemies to despise, groups to suppress, and ideologies that justify any harsh actions. The collective shadow becomes that force which absorbs the repressed fears and tensions of vast masses and transforms them into a destructive current of history. Jung emphasized that this is precisely why working with the shadow is not only an individual, but also a social process. He wrote, "The psychological law says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." These words apply not only to the individual, but also to society as a whole. What we are unwilling to recognize within ourselves, as a people, as a nation, as a civilization, will inevitably appear in the form of crises, conflicts, and disasters. Therefore, every step we take toward our own shadow is not only a personal liberation, but also a contribution to the common future. By acknowledging our darker sides, we break the chain of projections that feeds collective prejudices, hatred, and aggressive behaviors. Conversely, denial and repression only strengthen the collective shadow, leaving society vulnerable to fanaticism, rigidity, and destructive forces. A person who works with their shadow becomes not only a more integrated individual, but also part of that invisible support which prevents civilization from collapsing into chaos. And in this, perhaps, lies the central paradox. The most personal efforts turn out to be, at the same time, the most socially significant, because the work each of us does with our own shadow is a contribution to the future of all humanity. That is why the encounter with the shadow is not only a personal path, but also a collective one. Carl Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." These words sound like the conclusion of his entire teaching on the shadow. Light is not attained through illusions and self-deception. It arises only when we dare to look into the darkness within ourselves and acknowledge it as part of our own nature. The shadow is not an opponent and not an accidental flaw of our psyche. It is a doorway into genuine individuality, into that deeper self which remains hidden as long as we live only within the limits of a convenient and socially acceptable image. Only by facing it directly can we discover who we truly are. And only by passing through this experience do we gain the wholeness that makes us genuinely free.